I just want to introduce Dr. Thomas Timberlake. He's the Climate Change and Science Coordinator for the Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station, the Western Wildland Environmental Threat Center in Portland, Oregon. This session here, Dr. Timberlake will discuss resources available to support considerations of climate change and stewardship. We'll highlight climate change vulnerability assessments to develop national forests in the Western U.S. and how they could be used. So welcome, Dr. Timberlake. We're glad you're here.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for being here. So as Dan mentioned, my presentation today is focused on climate change vulnerability assessments, what they are and how they can help with stewardship. I think more generally, we'll be talking today about potential climate change impacts that could affect wilderness areas, and how through stewardship and sort of other activities we can adapt to the effects of climate change. There we go. Just by way of introduction, as Dan mentioned, I am based at the Western Wildland Environmental Threat Assessment Center with the research station, Pacific Northwest Research Station for the U.S. Forest Service, based in Portland, Oregon. Our group, WETAC, works across the western regions of the Forest Service to support sort of integration of science on climate change and other environmental threats into various aspects of land management. My work also involves working closely specifically with the Pacific Northwest region of the Forest Service, which includes national forests in Oregon and Washington. I worked for a couple years previously out of the Rocky Mountain Regional Office in Colorado. So just kind of want to note that while I will try to pull in examples from kind of throughout the Western United States, they may be sort of heavily Pacific Northwest or Colorado focused. Though I hope that there'll be some of what I'm sharing today will hopefully be kind of relevant at broader scales as well. So the topics that I'll cover today, I'll start with just kind of a little bit of framing on climate change and wilderness. We'll then talk about vulnerability assessments, kind of defining them, giving you some sense of what we're talking about there. I'll then use that to set up a kind of brief overview of some of the sort of key climate impacts that we're tracking and that we're sort of focusing on in management. Again, recognizing that these show up differently in different places and may not be entirely relevant across all of the landscapes where folks in the audience are working. And then we'll round things out with a little bit of a discussion, hopefully setting you all up to do some thinking about how you might adapt to the effects of climate change in your work related to wilderness stewardship and other activities. We should have plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. I also want to note that I have a few kind of questions for the audience thrown in there. So please do use the chat box as we go through to respond to those questions as you see fit. I'm hoping that those will instill some kind of learning across participants. And then I will, as mentioned, give you kind of a shout out to sort of prompt bringing some of those ideas into the room from the chat box. So the first question, though, this is often what I use to start off these types of presentations, is what changes have you noticed on your landscape in the past several years? Now, as you think about these don't necessarily have to be things directly related to or attributable to climate change. There's plenty of other sort of factors influencing changes that we see both on landscapes and the people using the landscapes that we steward. So it may not be a climate related change, but it may be something related to climate change. So as you maybe take a sort of as we go through the next few slides, please do throw your ideas in the chat, and we'll return to this question a little later in the presentation. So as a little bit of framing, I think I'll sort of note that in my, I kind of came to this topic studying sort of climate change adaptation and forest and natural resource policy. And in that research that I did at Colorado State University before joining the Forest Service, I would sort of read papers about how different policies shaping national forest and management of other public lands, how those policies would potentially influence our ability as agencies and as kind of a society more broadly to adapt to climate change. I think with wilderness and sort of the underlying legislation and sort of law, regulation, policy related to wilderness, you kind of see this potential tension between, on one hand, kind of viewing wilderness areas and the Wilderness Act as a potential challenge or hurdle that sort of shapes climate change adaptation. But then you also read perspectives out there that sort of highlight the role that wilderness areas and protected areas kind of more broadly play in supporting climate adaptation, giving species kind of places for refugia, kind of all of those types of topics. So just as an example, this paper, which was published in 2010, it involves a series of interviews of land managers across different federal management agencies, Forest Service, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife, and BLM. This study, kind of one of the findings was this top quote stated here that many respondents also viewed the National Park Service Organic Act and the Wilderness Act as potential barriers to adaptation. Now, the authors expanded on that, noting this piece, the second quote here, the respondents noted that the Wilderness Act's prohibition against infrastructure development and use of mechanized equipment in designated wilderness areas may preclude certain types of adaptation projects, and mentioned sort of some of watershed restoration or work in stream channels as a potential example of activities that could be precluded and that might be necessary for wilderness or for climate adaptation. This is just kind of one perspective. I think we'll also see, if you kind of read the literature for this, other perspectives kind of pointing out, no, there is an important role for wilderness areas in the context of climate adaptation. And also, I think this has been a topic that there's been some kind of theoretical, sort of conceptual papers out there also addressing this topic, including this one shown here on guiding concepts for park and wilderness stewardship in an era of global environmental change. This one in particular, I found pretty useful for thinking about the topic. Among other things, I think they just end the paper on this point about the challenge, therefore, is to continue a dialogue among scientists, managers, and the public to focus on the very large questions surrounding park and wilderness area management in a time of rapid environmental change. So I think today's session and kind of these types of convenings are helpful for continuing that conversation more generally. So where does this leave us? I mean, I think we know that there's this tension out there about intervention and non-intervention, different opinions on what role wilderness play in an era of climate change. My thinking on this, or kind of what I'm hoping the take home is today, is that kind of regardless of where we fall in the tension, there's a need to understand systems, how they've changed in the past and how they'll change in the future. I'm going to highlight today vulnerability assessments and some of the kind of related science that we have available as examples of one approach for informing these understandings. But I also want to acknowledge that there are different approaches out there that are being used, including sort of scenario planning, just having spatial data available is one of them. Ongoing monitoring activities are another example as well. So I'm going to jump into kind of a quick overview of climate change vulnerability assessments to give you some sense of what I'm talking about here. And I should note again, a lot of my kind of exposure to the topic is through the lens of the Forest Service. I previously sort of studied how the Forest Service was developing using climate change vulnerability assessments, kind of as an outside academic. And now my work involves developing and applying vulnerability assessments. So that's kind of the stance perspective I'm coming from. I want to acknowledge too, though, that many other entities, agencies, tribes, and others are all kind of developing similar products and working in kind of a similar space. So I'm hoping that some of the lessons today might be more broadly applicable. When we're talking about vulnerability assessments, the way I'm looking at it, I want to kind of think of them as both the end result, the publications, but also the kind of underlying processes whereby scientists and managers work together to identify potential impacts of climate change on a range of different ecosystems, resources, and values in particular places. So in defining it this way, I think I want to highlight both the end result, the oftentimes peer-reviewed publication or technical reports. Those are kind of one piece of utility here in the sense that they give you in one place an assessment of climate change impacts, but then also participating in processes like these, having structured conversations about climate change impacts, that there's also value in that people will learn just from participating in those processes and not just reading the documents. Want to acknowledge that across the Forest Service and kind of more broadly, there's plenty of different approaches to kind of doing this type of work and developing vulnerability assessments, or more broadly looking at climate change impacts. Again, hoping that some of the lessons today might be applicable kind of in those broader contexts. Also want to note that the climate change vulnerability assessments that we're talking about today, like this one pictured as an example for the Mount Hood National Forest, the Columbia River Gorge, and the Willamette National Forest, these are sort of more locally focused products that generally tier to some of the national efforts that the Forest Service, for example, has underway to address climate change. So they provide some kind of local context on locally relevant adaptation actions that tier to broader agency-wide adaptation actions identified in the Forest Service's Climate Adaptation Plan. Similarly, the Forest Service just last month kind of released a beta version of the Forest Service Climate Risk Viewer, which includes a series of different spatial layers available at the national scale, showing climate change risks and kind of values in the landscape that are at risk. Again, vulnerability assessments provide a kind of a more locally zoomed in perspective that tiers to this product as well. Kind of across vulnerability assessments and other kind of related products, the general approach here is to take something like climate change, this kind of broad and some ways cross-cutting, overarching topic, and give it some kind of local relevance by identifying specific impacts that are happening in specific places. And then also using this discussion to set up some sort of scientifically grounded adaptation actions or things that managers can do in response to these specific effects of climate change. Now, for those of you interested in learning more about sort of locally relevant climate change vulnerability assessments for your area, one opportunity to do this is using the Forest Service's story map tool called Climate Change Vulnerability Assessments Across the Nation. This lets you zoom into your particular landscape or local national forest and figure out which documents are relevant in that context, and then to kind of pull that information in, take a look at it. So this is just one tool. You also Google Scholar and sort of the Forest Service's tree search approach both allow you to kind of search for locally relevant information. So vulnerability assessments generally include several different chapters covering different topics. They'll generally begin with an overview chapter describing climate change for a particular area. That includes both the changes that have occurred sort of historically or over the past century, so those observed changes in climate, but also projections of future climate to give you some sense both of how much temperatures have increased over the past century and also how much more they'll increase into the future. Vulnerability assessments will also often include chapters on impacts of climate change on hydrology and water resources or watersheds, given the importance of those for national forests. They generally also cover impacts on ecosystems and specific species. Generally for the Forest Service, forested vegetation is a key consideration, but also many vulnerability assessments also consider impacts on non-forested vegetation or special habitat types. Vulnerability assessments also will provide information on potential effects of climate change on fish and wildlife species and associated habitat. They cover impacts to recreation activities, which is obviously important in the context of stewarding wilderness areas. And also some do cover impacts on cultural uses and ecosystem services. There's other topics that sometimes get covered, including kind of splitting out separate chapters on effects of climate change on disturbances, including fire, or impacts of climate change on infrastructure. Now, I'm going to kind of transition over to give you all a rundown of some of the potential climate change impacts that may be relevant for wilderness areas, particularly in the Western United States. Should probably kind of that huge caveat here that these are examples kind of picked from different places. So really want to you all need to do some judgment about how relevant these are to your particular landscape, or better yet, pull the local vulnerability assessment to kind of investigate what's relevant in your context. I will try to kind of ground all of these examples and information pulled from vulnerability assessment or kind of related spatial data, with the hopes that that'll give you some sense of the information that comes in from those. So I'm going to kind of pause here to see kind of what it came out of the initial question in the chat, and then also have you kind of consider this next question. So could you give me some sense of kind of some of the key ideas that came in from the chat?
Yeah, we had quite a few. And so wildfire, warmer temperatures, thawing of permafrost. Lori Smith had an interesting one, that not necessarily in wilderness, but she's noticed that the right size culverts previously are no longer the right size. They seem to be undersized. Courtney had a few, so some that speak to increased recreational use, more fees and crowds, but then also wildfire smoke and damage. Sharon shared that there are wetter winters, but also noted that the snowpack is less reliable than previously. Lori Smith mentioned that there's a death of hemlocks due to hemlock woolly adelgid. Did I pronounce that right? And
Adelgid, I think, but
adelgid.
Yeah.
And then Jody mentioned that most of the wilderness areas where she is, have been impacted by some degree of landscape level fires. And then one of the wilderness areas is experiencing glacial loss.
Great. Now those are great examples, Dan. Thanks for that. So kind of next question, and maybe your answer is the same as some of those changes you've seen in recent years, but also want you all to give some thought to what effects of climate change will have the biggest impacts for your landscape. So looking forward over the next couple of decades, for example, or even out to the kind of end of the century, what are you most worried about? And we'll again return to that question in a little while. But for now, I'm going to kind of jump into some of the kind of key climate change impacts that we generally think about. First and foremost, I think we start with maybe the most basic one, the most kind of clear and just easy to think about effect. That is, we have started to already see kind of increasing temperatures, and temperatures are projected to increase more in the future. So I'm just providing here as an example a graph showing changes in temperature over time for these three national forests in kind of north central Oregon. Obviously, as you'll see on this graph, there's a fair amount of year-to-year variability in the mean annual temperature, but the overall trend shows an increase over time. So as we think about kind of what we need to prepare for both in the present day and in the future, it's worth recognizing both the sort of overall trend of increasing temperatures, but also the potential for year-to-year variability and the potential for extremes. So when we provide these kind of mean estimates, we don't always capture those extreme events, and those can often have some of the most substantive effects both on human communities and ecosystems. So think about, even kind of past couple of years, average temperatures are higher, but we've also seen some of those extreme events like the 2021 heat dome that affected the Pacific Northwest, for example, with kind of record temperatures across many urban areas. You can then think about the potential effects too on recreation and also ecosystems associated with wilderness areas. Also, just wanted to highlight the fact that vulnerability assessments will provide projections of future changes in temperature, which can be both expressed in kind of numbers, graphs, and also in a sort of map format, like this example here that I pulled for the vulnerability assessment for the Intermountain Forest Service region, which covers national forests in Nevada, Utah, a little bit of Wyoming, and the southern half of Idaho. Vulnerability assessments will also report changes in temperature and some other metrics over multiple different time periods, often focusing on a mid-century time period as well as an end-of-century time period. So the mid-century time period is kind of centered on the year 2050. So that would be something maybe within our a planning time horizon or our kind of management career, whereas end of the century time frame may be more relevant as we think about sort of trees and sort of stand forest development over time, given the fact that trees often live for long periods of time. Now, the other kind of basic thing that we often focus on is effects of climate change on precipitation. It should be noted that there's less clear trends of how precipitation patterns have changed over kind of recent history, and projections are generally a little bit more uncertain about how precipitation will change into the future. So this is another example pulled from the Intermountain Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment that shows sort of total precipitation trends across several different kind of subregions. As you see for many of them, there's not necessarily a clear trend either way. And you see kind of year-to-year variability, but also some kind of interdecadal or several periods of low precipitation followed by several years of higher precipitation. So again, I think with precipitation especially, we want to think about that kind of year-to-year variability piece and the uncertainty into the future. With that said, we are able to kind of look at projected changes in precipitation across multiple different climate models. Again, an example from the Intermountain region, but this particular example, I'm sharing it just to sort of show that the range of different projections across different climate models, though many of them suggest a slight increase in precipitation, with some suggesting a decrease in precipitation. As you think about changes in precipitation, it's also worth considering how those changes may be distributed across different seasons. And that's something too that the vulnerability assessments will kind of break down for you. So for example, in the Pacific Northwest where I work, we know generally models suggest a slight increase in annual precipitation, but that's really concentrated during the winter months that are already rainy. So we'll have kind of wet seasons, but also continue to have pretty dry summers. So that sort of slight bump in precipitation may not save us from increasing wildfire activity and drought stress on trees. Now, these accounts of observed and projected changes in temperature and precipitation, then they're kind of the underpinning of assessment of impacts of climate change across different kind of resource areas or ecosystems, recreation, wildlife species, so on and so forth. So I'm going to highlight kind of a few high-level examples of these effects, again, with that caveat that these may not apply to your landscape, and to kind of go looking for that locally relevant information as possible. One of the big ones that I think shows up is this expected decrease in snowpack across many areas in the West, and also earlier snow melt. Should be acknowledged, though, that some of the higher elevation mountain ranges and watersheds, so those kind of think in the Rockies, especially Colorado Rockies, given high elevations there, projections suggest a relatively small change in terms of kind of an average April 1st snowpack. But kind of across the board with warmer springs, we're going to see snowmelt occur earlier. That said, for some of the lower elevation mountain ranges, including the Cascades here in Oregon and Washington, we are expected to see kind of more dramatic changes in snowpack in the future. Vulnerability assessments kind of more broadly, there's also kind of underlying spatial data that's readily available that should help you get some sense of how climate change will affect snowpack in your landscape. Glaciers is another one where we've already started to see decreasing glacier size, so glacial recession across many areas in the Western United States. Here's an image from our vulnerability assessment showing Mount Hood and showing kind of how the glacier extent has changed over the past century. Now, effects on snowpack will likely also have effects on sort of stream flow. In general, we're expecting to see across much of the Western United States, especially the kind of mountainous national forest areas, decreases in summer stream flow. That's generally associated with a shift earlier in the year of runoff. Of course, that doesn't apply kind of across all of the area. And we also need to take into account the potential for kind of some more intense summer thunderstorms in certain areas, and the fact that even if the mean summer stream flow decreases, we may still see kind of extreme flooding events. Speaking of flooding, we also have spatial data, kind of modeling data, showing changes in things like the number of winter floods, which we see some kind of pretty big increases, particularly in those lower elevation mountain ranges along the West Coast. Now, that's something we may be already starting to see in the context of some of those recent atmospheric river events that are bringing a lot of water all at once into mountain ranges and in turn causing some stream flooding. We also expect to see with warmer air temperatures as well as lower low flows, increasing stream temperatures and associated effects on fish habitat. Again, vulnerability assessments do provide kind of locally relevant information on effects of climate change on fish habitat, drawing in some modeling developed by the Rocky Mountain Research Station. Now, as we think kind of more broadly, and especially for ecosystems, I think one of the big concerns with regards to climate change and the national forests where I work in the Western United States is fire. I know this was brought up but in one of the comments earlier on, but with warmer air temperatures and the potential for less precipitation during summer months, we are expecting to see projected increases in area burned by wildfire, as well as longer fire seasons, just kind of a longer period of time when we see that high fire danger. And that obviously has implications for how we manage recreational use on the landscape. So I'm showing here one example of some of the sort of model maps that show up in our climate change vulnerability assessments. This one is focused on the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest in sort of northeast, north central Washington, which includes several kind of iconic, well-known wilderness areas, including the Alpine Lakes and the Alpine Lakes Wilderness Area. So this shows just kind of how over time the risks for large fire suitability are expected to increase. It helps with kind of figuring out which areas are expected to experience the highest level of change. There's other products out there, and I think also worth taking into account some of the near-term risk products as well. Now, as you think about implications of fire for wilderness areas, I think it's been mentioned, smoke in the air does have effects on people's decisions to recreate and their experience while doing it. We also see the need to implement trail closures and area closures while active wildfires are happening and also following wildfires. Fire also affects kind of destinations both within and outside of wilderness area and can affect infrastructure that's important for recreation, in addition to kind of all the effects on human lives and communities that we're also kind of concerned about. These images just are from, I guess, last summer / fall's fires in the Pasayten Wilderness in northern Washington, just as an example. Now, we also are expecting effects of climate change on insect activity and sort of other ecological disturbances. This is an example from the Intermountain Vulnerability Assessment showing sort of trends in numbers of trees killed by various different kind of insects. In addition to the kind of extreme disturbance events, we're also expecting to see changes in sort of more chronic changes in vegetation. And many of our vulnerability assessments include projections, kind of vegetation modeling projections of the future, showing areas more or less likely to change. This example from South Central Oregon, those red areas that you see kind of on the left of the map or the west of the map, those are areas, some of the subalpine high elevation vegetation areas where our indications are suggesting that those areas are most likely to see kind of type conversions as snow melts earlier and there's a longer growing season and they become more productive. So we have some kind of the lower elevation forests shifting up over kind of long periods of time. Now, in terms of recreation specifically, again, as I mentioned, many vulnerability assessments do include specific sections on kind of local effects on recreation. In general, kind of we're expecting to see an increase in summer warm weather recreation, also over a longer season. So as things warm up, as snow melts off earlier, we may see more use during shoulder seasons, which can present some challenges given kind of how we think of a sort of traditional recreation season. In many areas, especially those low elevation areas, we'll also see potential decreases in sort of suitability for snow-based recreation. So that's things like skiing, cross-country skiing, downhill skiing, though that's not happening in wilderness areas, but those types of activities that rely on snow. The example that I pulled here comes from a vulnerability assessment for the Sierra Nevada area in California. This provides some survey results showing how visitors might respond if the location that they're hoping to use for recreation weren't available. I think this is an important factor to recognize, that even if we expect to see kind of more demand for summer recreation, with effects of climate change on wildfires and flooding, we may see sort of a limited availability of sites, that it's going to be difficult to keep all sites open across all years to accommodate that increase in demand. So I think that's been the overall overview that I have of potential effects of climate change, kind of a whirlwind tour of maybe the types of information that you'd find in a vulnerability assessment. Again, want to dig into the chat and see, Dan, if you have kind of any of the key highlights that folks shared there, and what effects will have the biggest impacts on their landscapes.
Yeah, there were a few here. Courtney mentioned drought and fire, more extreme rain events, heat and drought events, insects, disease, and Soren had an interesting one, mismatching of future plant pollinator timings. If insect clocks are off, it has a potential effect. Yeah,
those are all good. And I think that last one, the sort of changes of phenology and all that, I think we often think about the kind of changes in space in terms of climate change effects, but I think equally important are those changes in timing. That comes into the earlier snowmelt piece, but also I think is readily apparent in those kind of mismatches in timing between pollinators and plant species. So to kind of round us out for today, I did want to give you guys some sense of sort of how you might take a vulnerability assessment, sort of how you work that into adaptation to climate change, given the fact that many of these vulnerability assessments are kind of geared towards this effort. Essentially, what we're talking about here is kind of what do you do with all this information that you find in a vulnerability assessment, or that you kind of already have on hand? How do you take that, make it relevant to your work managing or stewarding a landscape? I'm throwing this out, this is kind of one way that I conceptualize this, how you might apply a vulnerability assessment. I really want to provide this perspective to give to kind of acknowledge the fact that vulnerability assessments are kind of a top-down, high-level science synthesis. It's not the only source of information that you can or should be using to inform decisions. But we have vulnerability assessments. We also have the experiential knowledge that we develop from working on or recreating or visiting or otherwise stewarding or living around particular landscapes. That's relevant, I think, as we think about sort of developing this understanding of how landscapes may change. This, all in addition to the kind of forward-thinking vulnerability assessments, it's also important to incorporate monitoring of current conditions. I think it's always helpful to understand if we're starting to see some of the projected trends already show up in the landscape, or if these are things that we may anticipate happening further off into the future. And then also wanted to acknowledge that kind of vulnerability assessments are not the only piece of science here, not the only piece of information or knowledge that we can use to inform these types of decisions. So kind of as you think about how you might develop this understanding of landscape change and sort of climate change effects on landscapes, take into account this sort of multiple ways of approaching the topic. And then how I think about it here is that we take this information, we develop this understanding of how the landscape, how it changes, and then use that to inform stewardship decisions and actions that will hopefully help us adapt or otherwise just understand the risks on the landscape. I do want to kind of highlight that there's many different ways, many different kind of approaches and frameworks and resources for supporting adaptation efforts on national forests, public lands, and other places. I'm going to highlight a few here. I see no kind of this is better than that type approach here. It's just a matter of kind of what's going to resonate with you, what's going to work in your particular management context. As a first resource, I want to highlight the Climate Change Adaptation Library. And this brings together over 900 adaptation options that have been developed over the past kind of decade plus through a series of vulnerability assessments that have been conducted around the national forests and neighboring public lands around the Western United States. These adaptation options apply across different resource areas, including vegetation, wildlife, water resources, fisheries, recreation, and ecosystem services. That link there think you can just Google it. That'll get you over to the library if you're interested in looking there. Also want to highlight that there have been papers, specific papers kind of published that highlight adaptation strategies and approaches for different resource areas, including for outdoor recreation. This would be another place where you may want to look to get some sense of sort of adaptation actions that can be taken to prepare for and respond to effects of climate change. Now, there's also a series of kind of conceptual frameworks that have been proposed and are being used to guide climate adaptation. One of those is the RAD, or Resist, Accept, Direct framework, which I know we're going to have a couple sessions on, I think later today, as part of this same kind of track. So I'm not going to get into it in too much detail, but did want to acknowledge this is one way that you can apply the information from vulnerability assessment is in kind of decision-making guided by this framework. We also have, as a kind of alternative or complementary framework, the resistance, resilience, transition approach that has been developed and kind of promoted by Forest Service scientists over the past kind of decade and a half, almost 20 years now. This focuses on sort of resistance being this idea of resisting change, while resilience involves supporting ecosystems' ability to withstand or absorb changes, while transition involves sort of facilitating transitions to new states. I also just want to kind of acknowledge the fact that you might already be kind of adapting your practices or your stewardship as you're seeing potential changes on landscape or or trends that line up with kind of what's expected to happen as a result of climate change. So as an example here, I pulled kind of the latest data from a local snowtail site on Mount Hood that's near me that I think helps illustrate one of the potential effects we're expecting to see from climate change, which is this earlier snowmelt piece that, as you'll see here, the black line indicates the 2023 snow numbers for that particular site. As you'll see, it kind of peaks out just before May, so in late April, a little bit above the 30-year median indicated in that green line. But then over the past kind of week or so, couple weeks, as we've had particularly warm temperatures, you're starting to see snow melt happening earlier and kind of a lower than median snow number. So this is just one example of how you might pull in some of that kind of near-term current condition monitoring and contextualize that in trends projected in vulnerability assessment. All of these approaches, I mean, again, neither is right, neither is wrong. Use what you got for your particular landscape. All of this, I think, the goal here is to have intentional and specific considerations of climate change that then inform action or sort of stewardship decisions more broadly. They may not involve kind of active management on the ground. They may just be kind of more on the decision side of things. Regardless, though, the goal across kind of all of these frameworks, all of these approaches, get there to be some intentional and specific consideration of climate change up front and throughout the process. So to round us out, I'm going to give you some examples of sort of theoretical, hypothetical adaptation actions. But again, as you use the chat, please do kind of highlight some things that you might want to try out in your landscape or things you're already doing to adapt to either ongoing changes that may be related to climate change or some of those projected future changes related to climate change. So, for example, you may be especially worried about increasing temperatures and earlier snowmelt that will lead to this longer season for warm weather recreation. Strategically, this may require you to develop visitor management plans that accommodate changes in timing of uses. More tactically, this may involve expanding the season over which you require overnight permits, such that it starts earlier in the spring and ends later in the fall. So that's just one example of how you might kind of intentionally acknowledge this effect of climate change and modify management stewardship accordingly. As another example, as many people have noted, we're expecting increase in wildfire activity, a longer fire season, and increase in wildfire risk occurring during especially during those periods of high wilderness visitation, those summer months. So strategically, this may require preparing in advance to ensure a safe and effective wildfire response in wilderness areas. Tactically, this may involve educating visitors about wildfire risks and evacuation routes in the event of fires, using trailhead signs and digital messaging. Worth acknowledging, I think these are many things we're already doing, already thinking about, but we do want to articulate them in the climate change context. We might also think about incorporating considerations of wilderness visitors into those pre-season fire planning efforts as we kind of think about how fire might move across the landscape if an ignition occurs, having some sense of where people might be as they recreate in the wilderness. That's another valuable thing in support of this overall strategy. Then another example might be increases in periods of extreme heat will drive increased visitation in wilderness areas adjacent to cities. I do want to kind of note on this front that we sometimes think all about the kind of risks associated with climate change affecting the lands we manage, the national forests, the wilderness areas, but also I think we want to think about the role that those places, national forest, wilderness areas, and kind of associated opportunities to be in nature help cities and help people experiencing extreme heat. They offer opportunities for kind of adaptation. They offer high elevation places, tree cover, and access to water, all of which are important in the context of mitigating extreme heat. So in this context, maybe your strategy is to develop a robust system of access points to wilderness areas and connected trail network that it would accommodate those spikes in usage. You may look to explore options to enable public transportation access to trailheads to mitigate crowding in parking lots and sort of increase equity of accessibility. This may be only relevant in those urban adjacent wilderness areas, thinking about Salt Lake City, for example, but it is a tactic that I think could be considered. You may also want to think about education campaigns in advance of events to remind visitors of stewardship needs and alternative options if their favorite trailhead is full. Again, these are all things that are probably already in our repertoire, but the goal here is kind of articulate them in the context of climate change. And finally, we may see earlier snowmelt, longer growing seasons, which will lead to tree encroachment in alpine areas. When possible, maybe we try to resist this, but accept changes when they occur in some areas, given sort of limited opportunities for intervention. Monitoring for changes may be important in this context and kind of more broadly as we think about wilderness areas and climate change. Maybe there's opportunities when a fire burns through that may reduce tree cover. Again, another way of kind of articulating adaptation to climate change. We're going to kind of end it there just to note that I'm hoping that this kind of whirlwind tour of climate change vulnerability assessments and adaptation has been useful for you all. I'm always happy to talk about this and help connect you with kind of locally relevant information. So please do kind of use the email. I figure we have some time for a little bit of discussion now. So I'm going to, I guess, just stop sharing now and see what's in the chat. And otherwise, if it's feasible for folks to come on camera, I'm happy with that. I don't know what the general approach is. So that's it for me. Thanks for having me, and happy to field questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Timberlake. Yeah, if folks want to come on camera and ask questions, there's one question in the chat here. Actually, there's two. We'll start with Sharon's, and I'm not sure the answer to this one. Do any of the Forest Service climate change maps also include Alaska? I noticed you just had the contiguous US.
Yeah, and I should have done more for Alaska. I think there is a dynamic where some good amount of the model products that we use are contiguous US, lower 48 based, but we do have a fair amount of information that's also kind of Alaska specific. Sometimes it is from a different source, a different kind of underlying climate modeling effort. But that climate risk viewer that I noted does have information for Alaska, and also wanted to note that both the Chugach and Tongass National Forests do have some kind of climate change vulnerability assessments specific to those areas, which would be worth a look if you're not already aware of those.
Thanks. And I see, Dave, you put your camera on. Do you want to present yours?
Coming at this from the point of view of a boots on the ground volunteer, both locally in your old territory in Fort Collins, Canyon Lakes Ranger District, but also nationally, what role can volunteers play in terms of either information to agencies or public education in the current environment?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And I was just looking at what Courtney put in the chat after your point about, as a suggestion, dispersed camping ambassadors, trying to build public awareness, public ownership, that type of thing. I think it's also worth, you probably know this, connecting with the local units to figure out kind of where they're at in terms of messaging and to kind of bring this information forward. I think too, as a volunteer, I think getting familiar with what the science is saying about potential impacts of climate change and figuring out how you might work that into your efforts to talk to people on the trail I think all of those are kind of valuable efforts. Two, I mean, I think some of the same things we're already doing and we already lean on volunteers to do are going to become all the more important in a context with changing climate. As we expect to see maybe more people on hot summer weekends, there's more need for volunteers to kind of help us manage and communicate. So to a certain extent, it's more of what you're already doing with a new lens of climate change, but also kind of having those conversations, maybe pushing kind of local staff to sort of, hey, what are you thinking about in terms of climate change? I think those are productive conversations to have.
Dave, I dropped a link in the chat also. There's something that BLM Colorado has started to utilize as an application called CitSci, Citizen Science, and where we've developed projects with our partners on the CitSci app, where then citizens could just download the app and collect data for any specific project that the BLM's working on. And so we were in Colorado, we're specifically using this to just recognize the effects of vegetation regrowth post-wildfire. But anyone could create a project in CitSci and then anyone could go and download that app and collect data for that specific project.
Of course, we would want guidance as to what to collect.
Yeah.
And that's why the specific projects are created with those sideboards on there and the data that should be collected.
Yeah, thank you.
Go ahead, Courtney.
Hi. So we've been talking about adaptation and these projections of the future and ways that we can help manage the land to decrease damages and to adapt to them. Have you seen efforts from the federal agencies, any of them, to start divesting from the oil and gas industry and other greenhouse gas emitters and people who are making the problem worse?
Yes, I think, I don't know, I can't speak for overall kind of agency national policy on the topic. I think that's above my pay grade. I will say, I mean, I think the new or newer guidance and approaches in NEPA is to better disclose potential climate change effects, both on the kind of impacts on the ground, but also in terms of kind of oil and gas, greenhouse gas emissions associated with those projects. So I think that's kind of the best I can give. I generally work more on the adaptation side of things and have very little kind of contact with fossil fuel development, that type of thing. So sorry, I can't give you a better answer on that.
Okay, thank you.
One question I have, Dr. Timberlake, are you recognizing any areas of the country that are particular hotspots where we're recognizing the impacts of climate change maybe more acutely than elsewhere?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it is tough to, I mean, I think it depends on what impact you're talking about. I think so for example, the sort of snowpack and hydrologic change, and even the kind of flooding associated with more intense storms, we've seen a lot of that on the West Coast recently, and it seems like that may be more acute for kind of some of the West Coast coastal states. But also, I mean, I think fire is pretty apparent across a lot of the Western US, though not kind of everywhere. So those are some of the challenges. I mean, I think one other topic that I didn't really get into, but is the interaction between fire and post-fire regeneration of trees. It seems like though there have been kind of already, we're seeing pretty big impacts of climate change interacting with large high severity fires, leading to limited, if any, regeneration of trees. So you get this conversion from forest to non-forest. And that's something that's been especially concentrated, I think, in the Southwest and kind of Southern Rockies, kind of Colorado Front Range, for example. Whereas it's happened some in this region in the Pacific Northwest, but it's maybe less apparent and potentially less of a risk in our context. Again, though, you kind of can be hard to balance that given, sure. Yeah, but I think it's a good question, good thing to consider.
Sure. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, we really appreciate you taking the time to spend with the National Wilderness Skills Institute this year.